Rachel lay motionless along the broken edge of the ridgeline, her body pressed into dust and stone. The heat of the day baked into the concrete beneath her. She was perched above the skeletal remains of a semi-urban district that had burned, crumbled, and been bombed into silence long before her arrival. Below, charred walls leaned inward on themselves. Smoke drifted without urgency. Somewhere in the haze, the SEAL team moved with the hostages in tight formation, pulling them from the hollowed warehouse where they'd been held. Through the scope of her rifle, Rachel watched the lead SEAL give a quick hand signal, then shift position to check the rear. The rescued civilians moved unevenly, some limped. Others were half-carried, but all followed with silent obedience. Her reticle hovered just above the team, tracking their movement through the skeletal alley below. She didn't blink. She simply adjusted her breath, slow and precise, as the scene played out in monochrome light through her glass. The weight of her rifle was steady across her shoulder and spine. Dust clung to the sweat across her jawline, smeared in places where she'd shifted along the ridgeline earlier. Her ash-brown braid hung just behind her collar, tucked tight so no wind could tug it into view. Her gloved hands, one still clipped to her belt, remained quiet as her trigger hand relaxed alongside the stock. She was not tense. She was practiced. A voice came over her headset, low and clear, the kind used when things were going well enough not to shout. We're clear of the structure, beginning movement toward the landing zone. That was the plan: move fast, stay low, get everyone out before the enemy realized what had happened. A clean break. But Rachel had seen too many of those turn. Her left eye scanned past the scope. Something felt off. A flicker of shape beyond the remains of a market awning. Nothing sharp. Nothing definite. Just the kind of movement that didn't belong in the pattern she had been studying for the last hour. She shifted her view east. Rooftops looked still, but that didn't mean empty. A dark shape pulled back behind broken window shutters 2 buildings over. Her finger moved toward the trigger, paused, then eased back. She didn't have confirmation. A gull of smoke pushed higher into the sky, and for a moment, the wind changed direction. It brought the sound of shifting metal and hurried boots, then the sharp, unmistakable crack of a detonation. Rachel's heart rate did not spike, but her hands moved. The explosion had come from the narrow path the team had just entered. Then came the second blast closer, louder, and not shaped like an accident. Her radio cracked alive with overlapping voices. We're taking contact multiple sectors north and west. Civilians down? Rachel. Status. She had already adjusted. Her reticle swept left, snapped to a rooftop, an enemy fighter raising what looked like a rocket-propelled grenade tube from behind a solar panel. She exhaled and fired. The shot cracked clean. The rifle recoiled once into her shoulder, and the man folded backward out of sight. She was already shifting. Another shape darted across a second-story balcony. Rachel breathed again, fired again. Below, the SEAL team had split, one half pulling the hostages into a covered courtyard, the other laying down, suppressing fire toward the attackers trying to flank from the east. Rachel zeroed on the corner of a wall where movement had just flashed. Dust blew upward from scattered rounds impacting the upper floor of a building. To her right, she was not the only one being watched now. Her rifle swung smoothly, barrel kissing the edge of her cover. She found her next target mid-step. Another clean shot. Another drop. She counted. 3 threats down, likely more still repositioning. The ambush had been planned, not improvised. That meant more would come. Rachel, we've got wounded. Can you cover the alley behind the red truck? She replied calmly, already watching. A hostage had gone down in the crossfire. One of the SEALs scooped him up, cradling the man across his shoulders as they moved through the exposed gap between a rusted truck and collapsed scaffolding. Rachel held her fire for 2 long seconds, then snapped it left. A shadow moved through a breach in the wall behind them. She fired. Wall chipped. Shot corrected. Fired again. The shadow dropped mid-stride. Dust floated into her mouth, dry, and bitter. She swallowed it without pause and shifted slightly to her right, adjusting her angle before the wind shifted again. Through the lens, the world narrowed into distance, depth, and movement, shapes, breath, and time. That was all. The team was pushing again, slower now, but still moving. The civilians were scattered across the line, one limping badly, another half-dragged. Rachel did not look away. She simply adjusted her magnification and waited for the next window. From her ridgeline, everything seemed slow, almost quiet, but inside the headset, the chaos was climbing. She ignored most of it, not out of coldness, but because her role required focus, not reaction. She picked the moments that mattered. She let the rest fall away. Below, the mission had changed. Not failed, but shifted. The enemy was here now, and that meant the sky above them was no longer clear. The landing zone would soon become a kill zone if she could not shape the path before the aircraft arrived. She did not flinch. She rotated the bolt, reset her breath, and settled her rifle back to her shoulder. She could still buy them time. She could still hold the line. And that was all they needed. Rachel rotated the bolt and cycled the spent casing, her cheek never lifting from the stock. The next round slid into place with the faintest mechanical click. Below her, the battle had not so much begun as it had revealed itself. The calm had only ever been a skin stretched over tension. Now it tore open. Her scope snapped to a rooftop 2 structures west. 2 fighters sprinted for elevation, ducking behind a stairwell with what looked like long rifles slung across their backs. Rachel tracked the rear runner first. He moved faster and reached the edge sooner. He looked back once, mouth open in some unheard warning, then stepped into her reticle. The shot was clean. The man crumpled against the wall and disappeared from view. The second stopped short, hesitated, and made the wrong choice. He tried to return fire. Her follow-up round struck before he could raise the weapon. The rifle's recoil pressed evenly into her shoulder. She barely noticed it now. Her right elbow had shifted slightly on the uneven concrete, so she adjusted her position with quiet precision. She didn't need to move far. Just enough. A crack of automatic fire rippled from a lower alley. She heard shouts, some from the hostages, some from the SEAL team. The radio cut through sharply. Rachel, RPG north side corner of the Glassworks building. She already had the scope pivoting. North side, second level, broken blue window. The Glassworks building still had its steel frame, but everything else had been gutted. A fighter leaned out with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher aimed too high, likely hoping to hit the rear of the courtyard. Rachel paused. His grip was wrong. He was bracing it on a windowsill unstable. Still, one pull of the trigger would send the entire street into chaos. Rachel counted a breath. The sight picture steadied. She fired. The man jerked backward, weapon falling from the window and tumbling end over end until it clanged against the concrete below. Dust leapt from the ground where it landed. She adjusted magnification and scanned for movement near the body. None. The wind shifted and tugged lightly at her braid. She felt it, but didn't react. A sound near her left a drone's brief whir passing overhead, heading south toward the ridge behind her. Friendlies, likely reconnaissance. No time to confirm. A sharp scream through the comms pulled her attention back. Hostage hit front of the red truck were moving. Her rifle turned. The red truck was rusted through, long abandoned, half sunk into the dirt road that bordered the alley. A Navy SEAL had pulled a wounded civilian over one shoulder and was sprinting through the gap between the vehicle and the outer wall of a collapsed building. Rachel's scope tracked ahead of them, searching for shapes. A rooftop to the left showed motion, half a figure behind concrete shielding. She fired. Chips burst from the edge. Second shot. This one connected. The man slumped backward and disappeared. "You're clear," she said into the mic, her voice even. "Move fast." Below her, the SEAL and his burden made it through the alleyway and into a side structure. Rachel didn't linger on them. She was already scanning east. Something felt wrong. Too many attackers for an improvised defense. These were not random reinforcements. Someone had known they were coming. Through the smoke, another runner darted across an exposed causeway. He wasn't firing. He was moving fast and low, eyes locked on a metal stairwell that would bring him above the hostage's path. Rachel shifted her angle. The crumbling ledge under her elbows flexed slightly as she moved. She braced herself, ignoring the strain in her shoulder, and took the shot just before he reached cover. The man flipped forward and landed still. Her breath came dry through her mouth. There was dust in the air now, kicked up from the fight below. It stuck to her lips, settled on her scope, blurred edges until she wiped it clean with one smooth motion of her thumb. The wind was picking up, heat shimmering off metal and broken brick. Her body ached in small, specific places, elbows from the concrete, neck from the fixed angle, cheekbone from hours against the scope, but none of it mattered. She shifted her feet slightly, keeping them close to the ridgeline, not letting them silhouette against the sky. Somewhere, far behind her, a muffled detonation sounded, likely a distraction charge. Not her concern yet. Another voice came over comms, this one hurried but still controlled. "Rachel, east window, 3rd floor, movement again. Think they're spotting." Her scope was already turning. She caught the glint barely off what might have been a lens, a spotter or a sniper trying to find her arc. She adjusted 2 clicks left, corrected for height, waited for a breath, and fired. Glass shattered inward. The glint vanished. She pulled back from the scope for one moment and blinked. Dust clung to her lashes. Her breath was steady, but the silence in her mind was not emptiness. It was focus. Below her, chaos ruled. Above it, she carved angles into purpose. This was not reaction. It was selection. Every target a question, every shot an answer, and she still had work to do. Rachel adjusted her position just enough to keep the corridor in view. Below, the narrow street was coming apart. Smoke rose in thin, erratic plumes, each marking where the firefight had shifted again. The Marines were trying to push forward through the shattered buildings while the SEAL team moved the remaining hostages through connecting alleys. Every exposed moment became a gamble. She rotated the bolt and slid the next round into place. The broken street curved west and narrowed between 2 collapsed storefronts, the path leading toward the landing zone. That corridor had to hold. If it closed, no one would make it to the aircraft alive. Through the scope, Rachel picked up 2 figures darting across a 3rd-story rooftop. One carried a long, cylindrical weapon, likely another rocket-propelled grenade launcher. She adjusted for wind, took a breath, and fired. The man carrying the launcher dropped immediately. The second fighter scrambled for cover behind a rusted air duct. She waited 2 seconds, tracking the duct's far edge. When his shoulder appeared, she fired again. He folded out of view. The radio buzzed, faint through distortion. A voice cut through. "We need fire support east of the Market Arch. We're exposed in the alley." Rachel moved her scope. East of the arch was narrow and angled no clean view. She blinked once, then dialed magnification down slightly. Her vision widened just enough to catch 2 muzzle flashes behind a leaning brick column. She fired at the first, then shifted and dropped the second before either could reposition. Her breathing was even, but her muscles were tightening along the back of her neck. Too many directions. Too little time. The CV-22B Osprey was en route. She had heard the call over command net 10 minutes ago. That meant the aircraft was close, but not here. The team below was running out of minutes. Rachel stayed flat, chest barely lifting with breath, as she scanned west. A new column of smoke had started to rise dark. Heavy. Likely fueled by burning tires. That had not been there moments ago. The enemy was trying to blind her. She shifted her rifle and slid backward 2 feet, dragging it with one hand as she crawled to a new angle along the ridge. From her new position, she could just see the northern corner of a structure the hostages were about to pass through. Her scope caught the shape of a rifle barrel tucked beneath a collapsed wall. No movement yet, but she didn't wait. She fired, watching the debris shift as the body collapsed into the dust. The radio came again, this time clearer. "Osprey inbound. 3 minutes out. We need that path open." Rachel replied without lifting her head. "You'll have it." A gust of wind carried fine powder across the ridgeline. It swirled around her rifle, danced through the rising heat, and drifted downward toward the buildings below. She could see heat shimmering against broken windows, glass flickering as though still alive. Her scope tracked the length of a ruined balcony. Nothing moved. She panned slowly right, then stopped. 2 rooftops down. An enemy fighter was setting up a belt-fed weapon likely intended to rake the extraction corridor. Rachel adjusted elevation, exhaled, and pulled the trigger. The man dropped, weapon sliding sideways, belt still coiled around his arm. Rachel cycled another round. A second man moved in to recover the position. She shot again. The second fell onto the first. She wiped her scope lens with her thumb and settled again. Her knees and elbows burned from the concrete, but the pain had narrowed into something manageable. Her focus was clean. Below, the team was still moving. Hostages were strung in loose pairs between cover, lead, and followed by Navy SEALs and Marines who stopped every few meters to check fire angles. Rachel's scope paused on a woman in a torn green shirt, one arm bandaged with a strip of cloth, clinging to a Marine's vest as they ran. The woman stumbled. The Marine dragged her forward. A shot cracked from the second story of a nearby building. Rachel turned. Found the shooter. Fired. The man dropped back through the window before he could reload. A muffled boom sounded in the near distance. Smoke spread again, thicker, darker. Someone was burning debris near the courtyard. Visibility would collapse in minutes. Rachel pulled back, shifted again along the ridge, and raised her optics. She scanned fast, top to bottom. No new targets yet, but she knew they were coming. Another call. We're stacked at the courtyard exit. Need the last corridor cleared for final sprint to the landing zone. Rachel's reply was calm. Understood. Give me 30 seconds. She swept the length of the street from east to west. 2 buildings ahead, a rifle muzzle appeared at a rooftop corner. She fired. Farther down, a fighter stepped out to shout instructions. She shot him mid-word. A third came into view, dragging something toward a second-floor window. She held her breath, waited for exposure, and fired again. The corridor opened. Clear for now. Rachel exhaled slowly and adjusted her magnification to scan wide. Below, the line began moving again. Her job was not to lead them. It was to keep the road open just long enough. That was all they could ask, and all she needed. The shot missed her by inches. Dust exploded against the edge of the ridge and scattered across Rachel's cheek as she dropped flat. She didn't flinch. Instead, she drew in a shallow breath and began to crawl. The enemy had spotted her. Maybe it was muzzle flash. Maybe glass off her scope. Or maybe they had simply started guessing high, and one of them got lucky. Either way, her perch was compromised. She moved slowly, sliding across scorched concrete and fractured tile, dragging her rifle with her right hand while her left elbow bore the weight. Every inch forward ground her forearms against grit and stone, scraping through dirt and sweat. Another shot cracked above her, this one punching into the wall behind. The angle was climbing. They were trying to suppress her long enough to flank or rush the base of the ridge. She pushed sideways under a piece of collapsed rebar netting and angled toward the far end of the ridge, where a shattered scaffold leaned across a collapsed balcony. It wasn't cover. Not really. But it was better than where she had been. Rachel slid beneath the lowest part of the scaffolding, barely fitting her shoulders beneath a warped pipe. Dust clung to the sweat on her arms, and her breathing was shallow, steady, disciplined. She wiped the lens of her scope clean with the inside of her wrist and rotated back into firing position. It wasn't an ideal spot. Her angle of view was reduced, and debris blocked half her sight line. Still, It would work. She scanned immediately for threats. Below, the last wave of hostages was halfway to the landing zone. The radio crackled faintly command trying to coordinate final movement, but the signal kept cutting. She caught the word approach and then static. The Osprey was inbound. She didn't need confirmation. She could feel it in the rising urgency below. Through her scope, Rachel watched a group of fighters sprinting along the edge of a drainage path, weapons raised, trying to get ahead of the extraction team's movement. She led the first, waited for the stride to stretch, and fired. He went down. The next man dove behind a chunk of broken wall. She shifted a fraction, held steady, and fired again when his shoulder crept back into view. Her new position left her partially exposed from the right. She had no proper ledge to brace against, and the muzzle flash from her rifle would be more visible here. Still, she stayed locked in. The extraction team didn't have time for her to reposition again. The next group of hostages emerged from cover, 3 civilians led by a Marine moving fast and low. One of the civilians stumbled. Rachel saw it through the glass, just a slip on loose gravel, but enough to slow the group. Her scope shifted left, sweeping rooftops, checking for movement. Then she saw it. Second story. Window frame removed, barrel rising just above the sill. She fired before the shooter could settle in. The rifle kicked once into her shoulder. The figure at the window vanished backward in a tangle of limbs. More dust kicked up around her. She didn't look to see where the rounds were coming from. She adjusted the bolt, chambered again, and crawled 2 feet sideways, keeping her profile tight. She was bleeding from her left elbow now, though not badly, just a thin track, scraped raw from the concrete. The sweat on her back had turned sticky. Heat shimmered across the ridge. Her eyes stung from smoke and dust. But she never let them leave the scope for long. The sound of the Osprey began to grow behind the battlefield, the low thump of twin rotors building through the haze. The wind shifted again, this time stronger, scattering loose ash across the rooftops. Rachel tracked it through her scope, watching it distort her sight picture as it swirled past buildings and drifted in the street below. Her voice came through the radio, calm as ever. Rachel still in position. Corridor clear. But I've got movement southwest rooftop. They're setting up for a last strike. She shifted her body, rolling onto her right hip just long enough to get the new angle. It exposed her back to the ridge behind her, but she made the trade. Her rifle aligned with the rooftop. There, 3 men, moving fast, trying to mount what looked like a belt-fed weapon. The first lifted the tripod. The second carried the ammo box. The third raised his head to scan the field. Rachel fired. The spotter dropped instantly. The tripod man hesitated. She fired again. 2 down. The third crouched and tried to duck under a metal drum. She waited, watched. When his knee appeared in the gap, she fired. The weapon never went online. Spent brass scattered across the broken ridge beside her. She reached up briefly, pushing her braid out of her vision, then checked the position of the last group approaching the landing zone. They were moving slow, but steady, guided by a Marine and a Navy SEAL, side by side. One of the civilians clung to both of them, barefoot and limping. They were almost through. Rachel rotated the bolt again. Only a few rounds left in the mag. She still had her reserve, but she hadn't needed it yet. She adjusted position, then settled her scope on the corridor one final time. Behind her, the Osprey was descending now. Dust and smoke circled the rooftop as the wind kicked into a cyclone of grit. She could no longer hear the radio. The signal had gone completely to static. Still, she stayed calm. Her eyes stayed on the glass. Her fingers rested light on the trigger. She would not abandon her post. Rachel never said much, never asked for updates or backup. She simply held the ridge, because right now, everyone else was still moving, and they would not get another chance. Rachel lay behind a fractured concrete lip, her scope fixed on the narrow corridor below. Smoke filtered through the alley like sea fog, curling low around debris and broken walls. The final group of hostages was pinned behind the remains of a collapsed overhang. Nowhere else to go. Return fire from the enemy came in short bursts, meant more to keep them down than to land hits. But it wouldn't stay that way. The attackers were moving to reposition. If the corridor wasn't cleared in time, the Osprey would be forced to circle or break off, and the extraction would collapse. She rolled her shoulders once to release tension, then braced the rifle forward again. She had a clean angle, but just barely. Her view narrowed to a sliver between two broken stone pillars that had once supported an archway. Every shot would need to pass through that slot. No corrections. No second chances. Rachel exhaled slowly, eyes locked on the scope, and started counting. The first target appeared just left of the corridor, kneeling behind an overturned cart, rifle resting across the frame. Rachel timed his breath with hers, waited for the lift of his elbow, then fired. He fell backward into the rubble. 1 second later, the second fighter leaned around a shattered window frame to check the alley. Rachel's shot met him as his shoulder turned. The rifle's report echoed back softly, muted by the ridge and broken stone. She cycled the bolt. Her breathing remained slow. She did not blink. The sound of the CV-22B Osprey had begun to grow behind the ridge. The rotors spun faster now, vibrating the air with a rising thrum. Rachel did not look. Her eyes stayed forward. Dust began to stir around her, pulled by the pressure of the aircraft dropping fast toward the landing zone. The edge of her scope caught the flicker of light bouncing off moving glass, a signal. Movement on the rooftop at the far end of the corridor. She shifted half an inch and waited. A man crawled into position with a launcher slung over his back. Rocket-propelled grenade, not fired yet. He was trying to set up before the aircraft arrived. Rachel tracked his motion, waited for the moment his back turned as he adjusted footing, and fired. The man dropped, face first. The launcher slid down the slope of the rooftop and landed in a heap beside his arm. She rotated the bolt again and kept watching. Below, the group began moving. A SEAL at the front signaled the others forward. 2 hostages ran low and fast, guided by a Marine behind them. Rachel held her scope on the far end of the corridor, scanning the windows. Something shifted behind a door frame. She fired. The door cracked open and sagged off its hinge. More civilians followed. One stumbled, caught by the arm, dragged along by another. Then came the wounded SEAL, limping badly, one hand pressed against his own thigh, the other lifting a civilian across his shoulders. His head dipped with every step, mouth open, chest rising too fast. Rachel narrowed her scope. A figure appeared behind a cracked column to the left of the exit just movement. Nothing clear. Rachel shifted, waited for shape. The figure leaned out with a short weapon, looking toward the line of moving bodies. She waited, then fired. The shot tore through the center of the frame and dropped the target where it stood. More dust kicked up now as the Osprey came into view behind the buildings. The rotor wash funneled down between structures, pulling ash and grit into the air. The corridor below turned hazy. Rachel wiped her scope with the edge of her glove. Her cheek was streaked with sweat and dust. Her elbow burned from the raw scrape that had opened earlier, but she didn't feel it clearly now. She checked the final stretch of the alley. 2 hostages remained, crouched behind the rear wheel of a rusted-out vehicle. They hesitated. The SEAL ahead waved them forward, but something made one of them stop. Rachel couldn't tell why. Fear, confusion, exhaustion. It didn't matter. They had to move now. Then the flash, muzzle rising from the shadow beside a stairwell, almost hidden. The shooter aimed low, ready to fire on the final 2 civilians. Rachel's rifle steadied. There was only one angle. She couldn't miss. She counted 3 breaths. Let the 4th settle. Her pulse quieted. She squeezed the trigger. The bullet passed through the opening just as the attacker leaned forward. The shot struck center mass and folded the shooter before he could fire. The corridor went still again. The hostages moved. The seal behind them covered the last gap. Dust washed upward as the Osprey hovered above the landing zone. Rachel could see the edge of its ramp now. See the crew reaching out to pull civilians up. See the wind twisting through their hair and scattering dirt across the field. Every second counted now. But there were no more shots. No more figures in the windows. She had bought them what time she could. She rolled slightly, easing pressure off her shoulder, and chambered one final round. She scanned the buildings again, slower now, checking rooftops and corners, windows and ledges. Nothing stirred. Below her, the ramp lifted. The Osprey tilted forward, rotors angling as it began to rise. Its sound filled the space between structures and washed over the ridge like a passing wave. Rachel didn't speak. She didn't celebrate. She simply let her rifle rest across the pack at her side and closed her eyes for a second longer than usual. One final shot had carried them through, not just a bullet, a decision, a moment of stillness that had changed everything. The Osprey climbed through the smoke with its ramp sealed and its rotors tilting forward. The roar of its departure faded with distance, swallowed by the broken buildings and the rising heat. Dust swirled across the rooftops, catching in loose gravel and falling ash, then settled again as silence returned to the ridgeline. Rachel remained where she was. She eased back from her firing position, rolled onto one hip, and sat up slowly. Her joints resisted the motion, stiff from the hours spent motionless on concrete. The scrape along her elbow had dried and cracked, and her lower back ached from the uneven ledge she'd used for cover. But her breathing stayed level. She unslung the rifle and laid it gently across her knees, then pulled a pouch from her side and began collecting her spent brass. One by one, the casings dropped into the pouch with a faint metallic sound. They were still warm, slightly tarnished, but each had done what was needed. She paused once, glanced toward the corridor below, and watched the last of the dust rising from the street, where the last contact had fallen. Then she cinched the pouch closed and clipped it back to her belt. Behind her, the wind kicked softly through the scaffolding and rattled a length of chain hanging from a rusted beam. She listened to it for a moment. Then she reached for her rifle, checked the chamber, cleared it, and slung it across her back. She did not descend. Instead, she turned east, stepping across cracked tile and loose rebar. Her boots ground over broken glass, crunching faintly as she moved deeper into the ruined structure behind the ridge. Her shoulders stayed low. Her movements were smooth, practiced. There was no need for rush, and nothing left to say. The radio crackled once in her earpiece. A clear voice from Command Overwatch. "This is Control. Extraction complete. We've got a window for pickup if you're ready to drop to grid." Rachel kept walking. The ridgeline faded behind her, swallowed by smoke and ruin. Her reply came after a pause. "Negative. I'll reposition for next window." A beat of static, then a quiet confirmation. "Copy that. You did good today." Rachel didn't answer. The comms went quiet again. She stepped through a jagged doorway, ducking under a broken beam, then vanished into the shadowed hallway that led deeper into the wreckage. Her shadow faded against scorched walls. The wind moved through in her absence. No one followed. She would hold again when needed. Until then, she remained unseen,